He was sitting at an empty bus stop, shivering from the cold, when she approached him and offered him coffee. For her, it was just a gesture of kindness, but that was how a story began that would change their lives forever. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Snow was falling in slow, deliberate flakes that turned the city into a painting of silence. New York in December had a strange way of looking beautiful and exhausted at the same time. Lights burned in the distance, reflecting on wet asphalt, and the smell of roasted chestnuts from a street cart mixed with the metallic taste of winter air. The crowd that filled the streets a few hours earlier had thinned. The voices had dissolved into the hum of distant traffic and the muffled steps of those who still hurried through the cold. Laura pulled her scarf closer around her neck as she left the office building. The glass doors closed behind her with a sigh, shutting out the faint hum of computers and the smell of printer ink. She was the last to leave again. It had become her quiet ritual, staying late, checking details that didn't belong to her projects, fixing what others missed. The city lights stretched along the avenue like a promise she no longer believed in. Somewhere out there, people were meeting for dinner, laughing, decorating their windows. She was just another person heading home to an apartment that had forgotten what laughter sounded like. The air was colder than she expected. Each breath turned to mist, soft and fragile. Her boots sank into a thin layer of snow as she crossed the empty street toward the bus stop. A single lamppost threw a cone of yellow light over the bench, and there, beneath it, sat a man. He wasn't dressed like the homeless men she sometimes saw near the station. His coat was clean, his shoes shined, but his posture carried the weight of someone who had run out of reasons to stand up. A briefcase rested at his feet, and in his hands he held a thick white envelope. His fingers trembled slightly, not from cold, from something else, something quieter and deeper. Laura hesitated. There was an unspoken rule in the city. Don't get involved. But that rule had never made her feel human. She pulled her thermos from her bag, unscrewed the lid, and walked closer. The snow whispered under her steps. She stopped beside the bench and offered him a cup of steaming coffee. For a moment he didn't react, as if her presence hadn't registered. Then he looked up. His eyes were tired but alert, the eyes of someone who used to be precise about everything. He accepted the coffee with both hands, murmured a thank you. The heat from the cup rose in a thin curl of steam between them. She didn't ask what was wrong, but he spoke anyway, slowly, like someone reading a memory aloud. He had been a teacher, he said, history mostly, until the school shut down for lack of funding. His wife had left soon after, saying she couldn't bear to live with the silence that followed him around. The envelope, he explained, was the official notice of the divorce and a letter from the landlord reminding him the lease was ending in 2 weeks. Everything seemed to arrive on the same day, like fate signing its name twice. Laura listened without interrupting. His voice wasn't bitter. It was steady, almost resigned, as if he'd accepted that life didn't owe him anything. She understood that tone. She had spoken in it herself, years ago, when the papers were signed and the door had closed for the last time. She wanted to say something kind, but didn't know how. The right words had long ago turned to ash in her throat. The snow thickened around them, falling in gentle spirals. The bus schedule on the metal pole was unreadable, blurred by frost. Minutes stretched until they stopped meaning anything. Finally, she said that there was a small cafe open all night a few blocks away. He hesitated, glancing down the empty street as if hoping for the sound of an engine. But none came. So they walked together, their steps leaving 2 clean trails on the white pavement. Inside the cafe, the warmth hit them like a soft wave. The place smelled of cinnamon and strong coffee. An old radio played faint Christmas music, the kind that sounds sad if you listen too long. A waitress wiped the counter and didn't bother to look up. They chose a table near the window, where the snow outside looked like it was falling just for them. For a long while they said nothing. Laura watched the frost slowly gathering on the glass, and he traced the rim of his cup with his finger. There was no awkwardness in their silence. It felt like a shared language between two people who had forgotten how to fill the air with unnecessary sound. When he finally spoke again, it was not about the past, but about small things. The way snow changes the sound of the city, the books he missed teaching, the strange comfort of knowing the world will go on whether you fix your life or not. She found herself listening carefully, not because of what he said, but because of the calm rhythm of his voice. It had been a long time since she'd felt at ease around anyone. Outside, the night deepened. The snow piled up along the sidewalks. When the cafe closed for cleaning, they stepped back into the cold. No buses were running. The city had folded into itself, quiet and half asleep. They started walking toward the subway station together. Their pace matched without effort, as if they had been walking side by side for years. At the corner where their paths divided, they stopped. The wind carried the faint smell of bread from a bakery down the street. He looked at her, the faint reflection of the lamplight glinting in his eyes, and said only, "Thank you for the coffee." It was such a simple phrase, but it held a kind of weight she couldn't explain. She nodded, turned toward the station, and descended the steps into the underground warmth. As the train roared past, she caught her reflection in the window, a tired woman with snowflakes melting in her hair. But something in her face had changed. A softness, maybe. A flicker. That night, as she unlocked her apartment, the silence felt different. It wasn't heavy anymore. The rooms still waited in their usual order, the books stacked by the chair, the single plate drying near the sink, but they didn't seem as empty. She poured the rest of the coffee into a mug and sat by the window, watching the city's lights blur behind the curtain of snow. She thought of the man on the bench, of his calm voice, and the way he had held that letter like something already decided. There was no reason for her to think she'd ever see him again, yet part of her didn't want the story to end there. Maybe that was the strange thing about loneliness, how it could recognize itself in another person and not feel afraid. When she went to bed, she left the lamp on. The room glowed with a faint amber light, and the snow kept falling outside. Somewhere in that endless hush of winter, she felt a quiet sense of company, as if the city itself had exhaled and promised her that not everything was over. In the morning, when she woke to the pale brightness of the first sunlight in days, she noticed footprints by the bus stop outside her window. 2 sets, side by side, fading slowly as the sun rose higher. The sight made her smile without knowing why. She dressed for work, tied her hair back, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't dread the day ahead. The world outside was still cold, still vast, but something had shifted. Somewhere, not far from her, there was another person who had sat under the same snow and looked into the same silence, and that, somehow, made all the difference. The city woke in gray light, streets glazed with ice that caught the morning sun and scattered it in tiny flashes. Laura stood by her kitchen window with a mug in her hands, watching the traffic crawl below. The steam from her coffee drifted against the cold glass before disappearing, and she realized she had been standing there longer than she meant to. The night before still lingered in her thoughts. The quiet cafe, the man with the calm voice, the soft sound of snow under their feet. It had been nothing special, just 2 strangers sharing warmth in a frozen city. Yet she couldn't shake the sense that something had quietly shifted. The day ahead unfolded as all her days did: deadlines, meetings, the hollow politeness of office chatter. But beneath the monotony, her mind returned to that brief meeting. She told herself it didn't mean anything, that she was only curious about whether he had made it home safely. By the time she reached her apartment again that evening, she was no longer convinced. She found herself typing a short message on her phone, deleting it, and typing it again until the words felt harmless enough to send. She asked only if he'd made it home before the storm worsened. She didn't expect an answer, but one came almost immediately. He had. He hoped she hadn't caught cold. It was such an ordinary exchange that she laughed, startled by how much lighter the room felt afterward. Over the following days, winter settled more deeply into the city. Snow hardened along the curbs, and the air grew thin and sharp. Laura's life remained the same, yet she noticed small changes she couldn't quite explain. She started leaving the office earlier, cooking instead of ordering takeout, opening the window, despite the cold, just to hear the street below. There was a quiet pulse in her routine now, something that broke the stillness. A week later, on a Saturday morning, she went to the supermarket. The aisle smelled of oranges and freshly baked bread. She turned the corner and nearly collided with a man carrying a basket of groceries. The surprise froze them both, but recognition came a moment later. It was him. He looked almost the same worn coat, the same tired gentleness in his eyes. Only now he was smiling. They spoke as though continuing a conversation interrupted the night before. He offered to help carry her bags to the car, and she accepted before her mind could protest. Outside, the snow had melted into slush, reflecting the pale sunlight. Their breath clouded between words that came easily, as if they had known each other for years instead of a single night. From that morning on, they began to exchange messages more often. A few words at first, a recommendation for a book, a complaint about the weather, a joke about city buses that never arrived on time. The messages lengthened, stretching into the small hours. She learned that he had found part-time work tutoring high school students in history. He learned that she had once dreamed of becoming a teacher too, before life steered her toward advertising. They discovered the same kind of quiet in each other's stories, the quiet of people who had been disappointed but hadn't stopped hoping. Weeks passed in this steady rhythm, and with it grew a sense of anticipation that neither of them named. When they finally met again, it was in the same cafe where the snow had first driven them together. The waitress recognized Laura and nodded toward their usual table. The lights above the counter glowed soft and amber, catching on the window where snowflakes pressed and melted. He told her about a student who reminded him of himself at 17, restless, uncertain, full of questions about purpose. She told him about the office politics that drained her, about the fear that she was wasting her life on things that didn't matter. Their words circled the same truth. They were both tired of living half-lives. Outside, the snow began to fall again, the same quiet, endless dance. When they stepped out, the city seemed smaller, softened by white. He walked her to the corner where her street branched away, and though neither of them said it, they both knew they didn't want to part. Yet they did, politely, like two careful people afraid to hope too much. The next day he texted her early in the morning. It was a picture of a book lying open on his desk, a line underlined in pencil. Some people are not meant to save you. They are meant to remind you you're still worth saving. She read it twice and didn't reply right away. But that evening she stopped by a bookstore on her way home and bought the same book. Their friendship unfolded without plan or urgency. Some evenings they met for coffee. Other times, they simply shared silence over the phone, both reading or working on their own things. The comfort of those hours surprised Laura. She realized she didn't feel the need to impress or perform. Being herself was enough. The man she had met under a lamppost now existed like a steady line through her days. Not loud, not demanding, just there. In early February, she invited him to the winter market downtown. It was cold enough to see their breath, but not enough to drive people away. Vendors sold handmade candles, scarves, wooden toys, and spiced cider that steamed in paper cups. They moved slowly through the crowd, shoulder to shoulder, occasionally stopping to look at something neither could afford. At one stall, he bought her a tiny wooden model of a house, barely the size of her palm. "So you'll always have one," he said with a faint smile. She laughed, but something warm caught in her chest. As they walked through the maze of lights and sounds, she caught herself watching him, the way he listened, the way he paused before answering, the calm steadiness in his movements. He was not charming in the way men usually were, but there was something quietly magnetic about him, something that made her feel safe. Over the next few weeks, winter deepened again. The nights grew long and sharp, the streets emptied earlier. Their meetings became the small anchors of her week. She found herself cooking more often, saving enough for two, even when she knew he might not come by. He, in turn, began bringing her old books from second-hand stores, collections of essays, travel journals, things that carried the scent of other lives. In each of them, he wrote a small note inside the cover. Nothing sentimental, just observations, a phrase, a thought, a line that had caught his attention. She kept them all stacked by her bed, rereading the notes when the nights felt heavy. Sometimes they walked without destination. The city at night was their shared landscape. Street lamps, bridges, the smell of snow and distant music. They spoke of work, of youth, of how life can shrink when you stop expecting surprises. He told her he used to believe in purpose, but lately he was learning to settle for presence, just being where he was, fully, even if it wasn't what he once wanted. She said that maybe presence was the hardest thing to learn. One evening, in late February, they went to see an old film in a small theater that still smelled of popcorn and dust. The movie was slow and black and white, filled with long silences and unsaid feelings. When they stepped outside, snow was falling again. They walked to the bus stop, the same one where everything had begun. The lamppost still flickered above the bench, throwing a halo of light over the pavement. Laura stopped and looked at it. It felt like a circle closing. The bench was empty, clean, as if no one had ever waited there. She sat down, brushing off the thin layer of snow, and he stood beside her, hands in his pockets. The air was so still they could hear the snow landing. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she looked up at him, smiling slightly, and said that maybe some places keep their memory even when no one else does. He looked at the bench, then at her, and nodded. They stood there until their breath faded into the cold. When they finally walked away, the city stretched quietly around them, the sound of their steps sinking into the snow. There were no promises, no decisions, just the gentle certainty that they would see each other again, that what had begun in chance was slowly becoming something steady. That night, back in her apartment, Laura placed the wooden house on her windowsill. The city lights shimmered beyond it, distant and unending. She poured herself a cup of tea and thought about how strange it was that the smallest acts, a cup of coffee, a shared silence, a walk home, could rebuild the pieces of a person's life. Somewhere out there, he was probably doing the same, looking out at the same sky. And for the first time in years, the distance between two lives didn't feel insurmountable. The snow kept falling, but it no longer seemed cold. It was the kind of snow that promised a softer morning, and when she turned off the light, she carried the image of that empty bus stop in her mind, not as a place of waiting anymore, but as the moment where something had finally begun to move. The first weeks of March arrived with the kind of warmth that felt almost hesitant, as if the city itself wasn't sure it could let go of winter. Patches of ice still clung to the edges of sidewalks, and puddles glittered in the sunlight like fragile mirrors. Laura woke one morning to the sound of rain tapping against her window instead of snow. It was a small thing, but she felt the change in her bones, a shift in air, a quiet turning of seasons. She moved through her morning with an ease that had been missing for years. Coffee brewed while she opened her laptop to answer a few work emails, yet her mind kept drifting. It had been nearly 3 months since that night under the street lamp, and the stranger she'd met in the snow was no longer a stranger. Their connection had taken root in the small spaces of her days. A message before sunrise, an unexpected phone call during lunch, the comfort of his voice when she walked home through the evening noise of the city. She had stopped asking herself what it meant. Whatever it was, it had become part of her life. Quiet, necessary, real. They didn't live together, didn't make promises, didn't plan much at all. And yet there was a rhythm to their presence that steadied her. On Sundays, they met for breakfast at a cafe near the park, always at the same table by the window. He liked to read the newspaper while she sipped her coffee, and sometimes they sat for long minutes without speaking, the silence between them filled with warmth rather than distance. He had started a full-time position at the Municipal Archive, cataloging records and restoring old documents. He told her how satisfying it was to handle paper that had survived generations, to feel its weight and history beneath his fingers. She noticed how his voice changed when he spoke about it. There was pride in it, quiet, but unmistakable. For her part, she had recently been promoted to team lead at work. The title didn't change much in her routine, but it made her feel as though her efforts had finally been seen. Still, she often found herself counting the hours until she could leave the office and walk toward the places where she knew he might be. On Friday evenings, they sometimes met at her apartment. He would bring a bottle of wine, and she would cook something simple: pasta, soup, or roasted vegetables. The nights were slow and easy. They talked about childhood, about how both of them had grown up believing adulthood would be a straight line of progress, only to discover that life moved in circles. He told her about his father, a quiet man who'd worked as a mechanic his whole life and taught him that doing one thing well mattered more than doing everything fast. She told him about her mother, who had died young, and the way that loss had made her fear attachment. They didn't try to comfort each other. They simply listened. One evening, as they sat at her kitchen table with the rain whispering against the glass, he told her he still struggled with the sense of failure, not because of the marriage that ended, but because he had allowed it to define him for so long. Laura said she understood that too well. Her own marriage had left her convinced that being alone was easier than risking disappointment again. They both smiled at the irony. Two people sitting together, admitting how afraid they were of closeness. The honesty of it made something ease inside her chest. When spring arrived fully, they took their first trip beyond the city. He borrowed a friend's old car, and they drove north along the river until the buildings gave way to open land and quiet fields. The world felt wide again. They didn't talk much during the drive. The silence was its own kind of conversation. At a roadside diner, they stopped for coffee, laughing when the waitress forgot their order twice. The day was gray and windy, but when they reached a small lake surrounded by bare trees, the clouds parted long enough for sunlight to spill across the water. There was a wooden bench near the shore. They sat there, and she took the familiar thermos from her bag, the same one she had used that first night. The coffee inside was lukewarm, but he smiled when he saw it, as if recognizing a private language between them. She poured 2 cups, handed him one, and said that she sometimes thought life was just a series of circles, people finding their way back to where they began, but each time a little different. He nodded, watching the ripples move across the lake, and said that maybe what mattered wasn't how far you went, but who was still beside you when the circles closed. They stayed there for hours, watching the sky turn from silver to pale blue. ducks drifted near the reeds, and the sound of wind moved softly through the branches. There was peace in that stillness, a sense that nothing needed to be decided. When she rested her hand on his, it was a gesture that came without thought. His fingers closed gently over hers. No vows, no declarations, just the quiet understanding that this, whatever it was, had become something solid. Driving back at dusk, the car heater humming softly, Laura leaned her head against the window and watched the lights of distant towns blur past. She realized she no longer measured her days by what she lacked. For so long, her life had been a list of absences, people gone, chances missed, words left unsaid. Now, it was measured in presence, a message that made her smile, a shared silence, the warmth of a hand resting near her own. The realization didn't feel dramatic. It felt steady, like finally learning how to breathe again after holding her breath for years. When they reached the city, the streets glowed with the reflection of rain. The same lampposts stood where they always had, but the light they cast seemed softer. He parked outside her building and waited a moment before turning off the engine. Neither of them moved. Then he reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was an old map of the city, the kind printed before she was born, yellowed at the edges. He handed it to her. He said he'd found it at work, in a box of unsorted archives, and thought she might like it. In the margin, he had marked a small cross with a pen, the corner where the cafe stood, the place where they'd first talked. She traced the cross with her fingertip and smiled. It felt strange and wonderful to have their story fixed on something tangible, something that would outlast them. She wanted to tell him how much it meant, but words seemed unnecessary. Instead, she leaned over and kissed him softly on the cheek. In the days that followed, they continued as before, separate apartments, separate lives, but woven together by the quiet thread of constancy. He still sent her short messages in the mornings. She still waited for them. Sometimes she thought about how fragile it all was, how easily chance could have turned their paths away from each other that night. Yet that fragility made it precious. The final snow of the season fell in early April. It didn't last long, just a thin veil that melted by noon. But when she looked out her window that morning, she saw the bus stop across the street and thought of that first night again. The bench was empty now, the lamppost gleaming wet from melted snow. She smiled to herself, realizing it was no longer a place of waiting. It had become a landmark of something found. That evening, he came over after work with groceries in his arms. They cooked dinner together, music playing low in the background. When the food was ready, they ate on the couch, plates balanced on their laps, laughing about nothing in particular. The laughter surprised her. It was light, unguarded, the kind that fills a room and stays long after the sound fades. Later, as the night deepened and the city outside softened into quiet, she rested her head on his shoulder. He traced small circles on her wrist with his thumb, a motion as unconscious as breathing. Neither spoke. The lamp on the table cast a warm glow over the room, and she thought that perhaps this was what peace looked like. Not perfection, not certainty, but presence. When he finally left, the clock was nearing midnight. She stood by the window watching him walk down the street, his figure blending into the faint mist of rain. He turned once, lifted a hand in a small wave, and she waved back. The city seemed larger now, but not as lonely. The night air carried the scent of wet earth and the faint hum of life continuing in every direction. She closed the window, made herself a final cup of tea, and sat at the table with the old map spread before her. The small cross he had drawn marked the beginning of it all, but as she looked at it, she realized that every road, every line, led somewhere worth discovering. She folded the map carefully, and placed it in a drawer beside the wooden house he had given her. The two objects sat there like proof that something real could grow quietly, without promises or plans. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the clouds. The season was turning again. And as she went to bed, she knew that some stories didn't need endings, only the certainty that they would keep unfolding, one ordinary day after another, guided not by chance anymore, but by choice. If this story touched you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next story waiting for you right now, and share this video with someone who still believes that small moments can change everything.